Okay. Well, welcome everybody. I am Richard Piacentini. I'm the President and CEO for Phipps Conservatory and Botanical Gardens, and we are really thrilled to have all of you join us today. In fact, we have 61 people have signed up to attend today's webinar, which is really exciting, including, it's mostly gardens, but we also have a representative from a zoo and a museum attending today as well, which is really exciting because when we created the Climate Toolkit, the idea was that eventually we'd like to make this be relevant for zoos, aquaria, nature centers, museums in the future as well. And I think collectively, when you think about the impact that all of us can have in the botanical garden world, as well as the greater zoo and museum world, I mean, it can be pretty incredible, the impact we can have in inspiring our constituents to really adopt more sustainable ways of doing things. And that's one of the main reasons why we put the toolkit together, was so that we can all share and understand different things that we're doing to address climate change in particular. And that, we should be able to share those ideas. And so we're now in our second webinar, which is focused on how do you measure your carbon emissions. And that's really a first step. That we see that as a first step in really trying to understand, how can you actually reduce your carbon emissions? How do you track what you're doing, how well you're doing, and where you're going? The first step, obviously, is to understand your baseline and what the emissions are. So we're really pleased to have Mount Cuba Center actually go through the process with us and documenting our carbon emissions, and we want to be able to share that information with you today, and then offer to help anyone in the future that as you go through this yourself, that you can do this as well. We'll also be recording the session today, so if you want to go back and take a look at it later on, you'll be able to do that as well. And now I'd like to turn it over to Jeff Downing from Mount Cuba to say a few words as well.
Well, thanks, Richard. I'd like to start just by thanking you, Richard, and everybody on the Phipps team for your leadership and assistance in sustainability and thinking about climate change and these really, really critical issues in the 21st century. And we appreciate your putting together this series of webinars to help us work through these things. At Mount Cuba Center, we're a small former estate garden that's focused on native plants and conservation, but being about conservation, about the most critical threat to native plants and habitats in general is climate change in the 21st century. So in the interest of living up to our mission, it's been something that's been on our mind for a long time to try to get a handle on our overall carbon footprint so that we can then make progress. One of the biggest sort of first goals in the Climate Toolkit that Phipps has put together is to commit to reduce your carbon output by 25%. And we've for a long time wanted to be able to commit to that, but we didn't even know where to start as far as how to even get a handle on what your carbon footprint is. And it was in talking to this group from Phipps about ways that they were interested in figuring out how they could be of greatest assistance. And I said, well, we've been looking for a way to benchmark our carbon, but there's so many ways to do it. You can hire an expensive consultant. There's numerous tools on the web of various sort of degrees of reliability, and we didn't know which of those tools to choose, which of those paths to go down. And as it happens, the Phipps folks have recently gone through this process themselves and had some recommendations for a tool that works really well. And so we said that we would also work our way through the same process. And with their assistance, we've been able to get a really good benchmark for our organization that we can now use as we go forward and get a sense of how we can make improvements through the various ways in which we can have a positive impact on our carbon footprint. So thanks for putting this together. We look forward to sharing our experience. And you're muted.
You're right. Thank you, Jeff. And now I'd like to turn it over to Steve McCann from our Cuba Center and Adam Haas from Phipps. So they're the ones that actually went through the process and actually worked their way through the different systems, and to share their experiences with you and show you how they did it.
Great, thank you, Jeff. Thank you, Richard. I'm Adam. I'm here at Phipps, and Steve and I did go through the process and shared some information. So our plan today is to just give a little background on the tool and then go tab through tab. I'll share my screen with the spreadsheet on it, and we'll just go tab through tab and show what they're looking for and how we went about it. And then we like to leave enough time at the end, of course, for questions. But just real quick, and Steve, feel free to jump in at any point. I just wanted to talk a little bit about the different scopes of emissions. There's 3 distinct scopes of greenhouse gas emissions. In this spreadsheet, this calculator tool addresses all 3 of them. Scopes 1 and 2 are, sort of requisite for any carbon inventory that you do. Scope 3 is where it gets a little, I don't want to say dicier, but there's more in the way of estimation and trying to figure out exactly how to calculate these things. And we so far have done scope 1 and 2, and we're starting to work on scope 3. But what scope 1 is all emissions that are related to on-site fossil fuel combustion or fleet fuel for your fleet, your leased or owned fleet. So this is if you have a boiler on site, if you have generators, things like that, anything that you're burning on your actual site. Same with bobcats or tractors or anything like that. So that's also referred to as direct emissions. They're being burned right there on your site. Scope 2 are indirect emissions. So it's not happening on your site, but it's being burned somewhere else for something on your site, specifically electricity, heat, steam, anything like that. So anything that's going to give your institution power, lights, anything like that. It's typically not being burned right there. At least most of it isn't. So that's what we consider indirect in scope 2, and add those 2 together. And those are sort of the basic carbon footprint you can do. And those are the 2 that we've done so far. And again, we'll go through tab by tab what they're looking for each. And then scope 3 are emissions that are from sources that aren't directly owned or controlled by you, but again, are burned because of your activity. So your staff commuting to work, travel to conferences and things like that. Remember doing that. Deliveries that come to your garden, waste that gets sent off site, things like that. So that's the quick rundown of the different scopes. And I will share my screen now. And everyone's seeing that okay? Great. And so this tool.
Hey, Adam.
Yes.
One thing we should have said, if anybody has any questions along the way, you can put them in the chat, and then we'll have Annie, we'll read them out at the end, and we'll be able to have the speakers answer any of the questions.
Great, thanks, Richard. Yeah, please fire away as we go, and we'll leave, again, we'll try to leave time at the end to address them, and can get back to you if we don't have time. So as was mentioned, as Jeff said, there's a lot of different ways to do this. You can hire consultants. Sometimes it seems complicated and exactly which route to go. And this isn't the only way to do it. There are other tools, there are other methods, but we liked this one a lot. It's designed specifically for relatively small emitters, so small businesses, institutions, that it addresses the emissions that these places will probably have. And the nice thing about all using the same type of thing is that it's standardized, right? So we can each do our own footprint, and how we define the scope of those things and how we set the boundaries individually are going to impact how we measure things. But by using one tool, the EPA one, it's going to allow that standardization across, so we can see how we're doing compared to other people, where people are doing better than us, how we can do what they're doing. So that standardization is really nice. The tool itself is quite robust in its instructions. So it has a fairly in-depth introduction where it tells you about what it is. Also from the EPA, you can download, it's like a 20-page PDF just talking about this process, how you would do this calculator to benchmark, and then some steps you can take from then on out to make sure your data is looking good, and how you can do a reduction plan, things like that. So there's lots of resources even beyond this calculator. So after the introduction, you have the summary page, and this is where you start defining the boundaries for which you're going to conduct this. So you can see here, we're Phipps, and this gets auto-populated. You fill in the data, your address, things like that. And then the reporting year, that's up to you. We chose calendar 2020. Mount Cuba did something, 2020 is an anomalous year. It's pretty atypical. It's not necessarily that helpful as a benchmark, but I think we chose to do it because it will be very helpful to see, compare it to future years and typical operations. But Mount Cuba went back, correct me if I'm wrong, but a couple years, 18 and 19.
2018.
Yeah, right. So this is up to you. It doesn't have to be calendar year. It can be fiscal year. You might just want to start, next month. And so you can go from that point on. Our process was a little bit different because for us 1 year, and for Mount Cuba a couple years, it was retroactive. So it was a little bit of forensic work going back and looking at receipts of things that had happened in the past, but still not that challenging. But one nice thing to know is, once you're going to do this, you can put the processes in place that going forward, you don't have to kind of do that back end work where you're going to finance and saying, hey, can I see the receipts for this year? The beginning of 2020, we knew we were doing this, of 2021. So I talked to the facilities team, and so we got odometer readings on all the fleet. So we didn't know how many miles were going on each year at the start. So we'll see when we go into that tab how we ended up doing that. But if you're going to do it going forward, you can put processes in place that make it all the easier. And then this page, your summary page, is going to auto-populate as you complete each tab with the data based on what you enter. And so you can see these figures here. These are all based on the tabs we're going to go over. And it gives you this nice, exactly what it is, a summary. The next page before you start getting into the data entry is, again, to help you define what the boundary is. And this is all the different tabs. It basically asks, do you have this at your facility? And you say yes or no. If you say yes, you're going to fill out that tab. If you say no, you're just going to skip it because there'll be no emissions related to that. So for example, we have all these, we have air conditioning, we have stationary combustion, we have fire suppression. We don't purchase gases by their definition of how that is. So we have an N there. We don't flare waste gases. So there's N's there as well. So this is basically just telling me what tabs I'm going to complete. And then we get into the data. So the first tab, scope 1, again, scope 1 is what's burned on your site. And this is stationary, things that are staying in one place, versus the next one, which is mobile, but being burned on your site. And you'll see it's really nice because our gardens, our institutions are quite different. We're a relatively small urban campus versus Mount Cuba. So the type of data we're going to have is quite different. So I just entered here. This is anything on our site that gets burned. So we have our generator. So to figure out how often this runs, it's tested every 2 weeks. It was just some conversations with facilities and seeing, okay, we know it runs every 10 minutes every week to test. And this is the kind of, this is about how much fuel it's going to burn during that time. If you had if you knew how much fuel oil that you purchased for that year, you could do it that way. This 160 is an estimation, as some of these things are. Sometimes you can't get the exact number, but this was, okay, this thing's running 10 minutes every week. It's about this many gallons per week. That's about 160 gallons. And so, in the fuel combusted field, there's a pull down here. And in a lot of places, it will define for you what the options are. So we just selected from the options what our fuel was. You pull it down, you enter in your data, And then that is going to auto-populate at the bottom your values, right? So all you have to do is enter the fuel type. Over here, the source ID and the source description, these are just for you to help kind of keep track. And you'll see on Mount Cuba's page, you can decide what works best for you. If you have 10 generators and you want to enter 10 independent generators, that's fine. If you have 10 generators and you want to do it as just one, that's fine too. It's not going to change the numbers at all. It's more for your sort of accounting. The more granular you get, the more opportunity there is, I think, to recognize where there might be discrepancies or where you can make adjustments. But the data is the data. If it's 160 gallons over 10 of them or one of them, it's 160 gallons. Propane heaters, this was quite negligible because typically in the winter flower show, we burn a lot of propane in the sort of standalone heaters that are so popular right now. But given that show didn't happen in the way it typically does, that was quite low. So it's really just kind of entering any sort of combustion that happens on your site. Steve, do you want to?
Sure. You want to move to our tab?
Yeah, there we go.
Alrighty, so obviously we have quite a different fuel sources or fuels used here at Mount Cuba Center. We have, coming from a former private estate, there were tenant houses on the property. Most of them are either unoccupied or just being converted into office or storage space. So this is just some of the wording we use here for that. We have, in 2018, we had 3 generators. The greenhouse generator was just recently put out of service. It's going to be of a different size, so we'll note that moving forward. I know when Adam moused over the fuel column and it selects the fuel or the type, it actually populates the units column. So for us, the challenge was that, for example, the natural gas on our bill, it came in as CCF, and the dashboard or the calculator wants SCF. So I had to reach out to our local utility to figure out how to convert that over. So that was just one of the little challenges we had. Same with the generators. The generators, that information was coming in by, I think, cubic feet per hour or something to that effect. And I was able to find a calculator to get it down to gallons to get it into this, emissions calculator that the EPA uses.
And that's a really good point, Steve. I'm going to scroll through these tabs really quickly to get to the end. Every one of the tabs for each of the different sources has a separate tab for help. So it takes you into a little more depth about what is on that page and helps with guidance on how to do that. There's also unit conversion page where, as Steve was saying, it's important to recognize units because sometimes you're going to have units that aren't what the calculator wants. So the onus is on you to make sure that they're in the units that they're asking for. And they're quite clear in what they want. It's just you have to make sure that you're putting them in as the same. And so there's some of that here, some, as Steve said, reaching out to different entities. So I guess there wouldn't be any questions because we're throwing them in chat. So I'll just go ahead and keep going over to the next, which is mobile sources. So this is, again, anything burned on site, but is not stationary, it moves around. So that's your truck fleet, your Bobcat. We have a Bobcat and a Kubota. They're both diesel. So you see in the pull down here, as you said, it has all these different options, anything from passenger cars, ships and boats, if you have ships and boats and locomotives. So it's quite extensive in what you can select from. We don't have a huge fleet. Again, we're sort of a tight urban campus compared to a lot of gardens in Mount Cuba as well. So this was just figuring out, this is one of those forensic things. We didn't know how many miles we drove, but was just getting the credit card from facilities, going through 1 year of receipts, and anytime they were at a gas station, looking at the value. So we totaled up how much they spent on fuel in that year. And then we went through and said, okay, this was about how much fuel was per gallon at that time. It was every month or something like that. And that gave us a way to figure out how many gallons of fuel were purchased. And then you estimate your miles traveled based on that. You can enter that data. If you know it, you put it in. If not, it gives you guidance about how to estimate. Same with up here. It assumes that there's about 20% of, actually looking at that doesn't add up to 100, which is interesting, but it assumes certain data. You can change that if you know it to be different, but it will estimate certain things and make assumptions for you. You can make it more accurate the more you know, but you don't have to know every single thing. And then hop over to you, Steve.
Okay, so with the vehicle type, if you can mouse over that again, Adam, you showed that there's just different types. It's mostly either gas or diesel. So with Mount Cuba, we have approximately 40 gas or diesel motorized pieces of equipment, whether they're, pickups, dump trucks, SUVs. We have Kubotas, we have tractors, riding mowers. So one thing is to try to calculate or figure out what they fall into. And then of course, some are diesel, some are gas, and then doing the calculations. I left some of the ones up like for other diesel sources. Under other gasoline sources, we track when we fill gas cans that are then taken out into the field to power portable string trimmers, things like that. So we didn't really in 2018 use any other diesel powered gas can type unit. So, but I figured I'm going to leave it there because in future years we may be going in that direction. Yeah, so that's just, and again, we had all this data as far as the fuel used, because we were able to actually fuel all these vehicles on site. And at each filling station, we have a clipboard there that tracks, the day, the driver, the mileage, or the hours of the equipment, and then the gallons put in. So it's just a matter of totaling up for the year per vehicle.
And that's a good point, Steve, as well. This is chainsaws, leaf blowers, things like that.
Mm-hmm.
There's not much on our page of that. We don't have a ton of that equipment because our grounds aren't quite that big, but also we've switched to electric for quite a bit of that.
Right.
So any charging of that would be accounted for in our electricity page. Here's where you would add any of that. Some places have quite significant equipment that would be counted there. We'll hop over to the next one, so we're still on scope 1. This is still stuff happening right on your site. This is refrigeration and air conditioning. So up at the top, it gives you some guidance about how to complete this. This is a little more arcane than some of the other things. And then again, there's a help tab at the end, but it's just trying to figure out if any refrigerants, which can be quite potent greenhouse gases, make sure that those are accounted for. So the way we did this was we have a staff member who is a certified HVAC technician. And so some of this happens on site through them. So I talked to him. He had a record of we had a small leak in one of our air conditioners. So he was replacing refrigerant in that, which is captured here, as well as he had some back stock of it. So you count things that if you're storing it on site to replace it, that does count it, and that's in the guidance. You don't have to count what's already preloaded into the air conditioner. So you don't have to worry about saying we have this many air conditioners and this how many refrigerant it holds, and that would get quite difficult. But when you do have an inventory change, that's when you mark it. So the cafe is this little fridge for drinks for people to grab that needed a recharge. So it was about a pound of this gas. And as you can see, there's a lot of different numbers that, to me, it's all Greek, but that's all inventoried. So the other, they knew exactly what kind of gas it was. You pull it down. We also have large scale refrigerators and stuff for our catering and kitchen that is serviced by an outside corporation. So the method for getting that is they have to track all those gases. If so, your fridge is on the fritz, you call them up, they come in, they have to add refrigerant. That's recorded and should be in the invoice for the transaction. So it was going through that last year and seeing if, what, if any, was there. The one thing I will mention really quickly here is because you see this big extensive list of numbers and gases. This R407C, for whatever reason, the specific gas that we used wasn't represented there. And so what I did, just as an example of some of the things you might be having to do when you do it, I just went through, I looked up the GWP, which is the greenhouse warming potential of the gas, how potent it is. And I found another gas, the one we used wasn't here, but it was about 1800. And so I just picked the one that was closest to that figure. So again, you might not run into this, but just a quick example of how this might not be perfect, but there are ways to still get a pretty accurate and true representation of your emissions. I don't think there's a Mount Cuba page for this, so we'll just keep on going. For fire suppression, we didn't have any data for this. So this is, again, a lot of fire suppression systems are going to have some of these gases that are in them, but unless they're discharged, you don't have to count them. If they are discharged and then have to be refilled, the firm that does that will have an accounting, and they'll be able to tell you what, and how much pounds of HFC whatever is put in. So that's just looking for data from the company that would do it. It does also account for fire extinguishers, so portables would count here. If you have a bunch of fire, say you have 20 fire extinguishers, we had 3 of them replaced this year because as they came through to do their safety checks, the fire marshal, he said, these are out of date now, let's get you new ones. So you would account for those because that gas, it's not being spent, but essentially it's being taken out. So we just looked at the ingredients in those specific fire extinguishers we had. So some models use CO2 as a propellant. And so you would indicate that, and that should be indicated on the thing itself or the material safety data sheet that you can look up for your model. And the ones we use aren't CO2 propelled. So we didn't have to account for that because these gases weren't represented. I'll zoom in a little, it's pretty small. So purchase gases, similarly, this is, every garden and every institution is going to be different, but these are probably less likely. This and the next one, waste gases, are more for different types of industries. Like if you're purchasing gases for your industrial processes, this would be where you capture that. They highlight, I think it's 8 or so most potent greenhouse gases, or I guess more than that, but or variations of them. You would capture that here. Again, it's unlikely that this will be a tab that needs to be populated. Same with waste gas. It mentions things like print shops and things like that have VOC emissions and certain things that you flare. Again, probably not. But if you do have those things, this is where you'd put them. The next tab is electricity. So there are 2 different ways. There's the market-based system and the location-based system, and they want you to do both of these. And so what location-based is, you select from the pull down over here where you're physically located. So you make the selection, and there's a map at the bottom of this page to help you. If you don't, you're not going to know what grid area you're in, what e-grid subregion probably, but you just look at the map that's at the bottom of this tab. And there's a link too to get nice and close if you're we were unclear because we're kind of over 2 there. You look that up, you enter that in the pull down, and then you enter your kilowatt hours. So this is pretty straightforward. You'll have utility bills. We track it for each different meter that's coming in. I just totaled everything up, but you would have more, it might be more helpful for you to go into each individual. We have the conservatory, we have the production greenhouse, we have different meters. So if you wanted to, you could indicate all those separately. You'll see over here on the left, I indicated in the description, this is all meters less our PVs. We do have on-site production. We have photovoltaics. There isn't a way to account for those in this on this page. And so I just subtracted from our total kilowatt hours what we produced, what we purchased. I just subtracted what we produced. And so that auto-populates the data over here. Then what market-based is this allows you to account for if you have some sort of purchasing agreement. So what we do, we generate electricity on site, but it's not enough to power all the campus. But for the remainder, all the remaining electricity, we purchase through a green power company. So 100% of our electricity is either produced on site or purchased as green power. And so this is where we can account for that. And so our market-based number, our carbon emissions based on the market-based system is actually 0, because everything electricity-wise that we're using is 0 emissions. If you say you had 200,000 kilowatt hours and you purchased, 80,000 of that of green, then you would put in into here in the market-based that difference that would be there. And I will hop over to your page now, Steve.
One of the main reasons we chose 2018 as our year is because in 2018, we had 100% non-green purchased electricity. Halfway through 2019 is when we switched to 100% wind energy, and then into 2020 as well. So I decided to break out, we have 11 different accounts with our local utility. So we are in the process, moving probably into next year in 2022, you'll start to see some photovoltaics go up. So I want to kind of break it down according to the meters so we can see our reduction and track it sort of like how you were mentioning, Adam. Obviously when we start to do this again for this year, we will be obviously all green and have to do the, sort of the calculation like you did.
Great. So next we're on to steam heat. This was, our conservatory is heated with steam at a nearby boiler plant. And so this also is market and location based. So, we knew how many BTUs were coming through. The boiler efficiency auto-populates here. I Googled online and went to the website of the boiler plant, and I could find, they did have data on their efficiency. So I tweaked that slightly. 80's the standard, they're a little bit higher than that. I couldn't find, here in this yellow is where you would enter these emissions factors here. If you know them, so they might publish them, you would enter them here. If not, it auto-populates a sort of standard. And then that's it. Then it calculates down here. It has, it auto-fills those figures if you do not put anything in. Pretty straightforward. And we'll see at the end, tools like this help you realize there's not a lot we can do about the way Belfield boiler produces steam. It's now natural gas. It used to be coal. So the biggest chunk of our carbon emissions, at least for scope 1 and 2, by a fairly long shot, is the natural gas we use. And that's the entirety of scope 1 and scope 2. Those are, again, the sort of baseline. Anytime you would do a carbon footprint analysis, you would include these two scopes. The more thorough you are, the more you can include in scope 3, the better. And I'll quickly go through these tabs, what they're looking for, and then we'll hop into the questions. But scope 3, I started populating this. Scope, 2020 was a pretty minimum travel year. It was basically January, February, and a little bit of March. So it was pretty easy, but we could look at our travel budget and who went where. It was small enough this year, we knew exactly who it was. And it gives you the option down here is air miles. And you just, if you went to Scottsdale, you figure out how far that is, you punch that in, or rail and bus, it gives you these options and it breaks it down further into the type. So the question then becomes, and Steve and I were talking about this. So yeah, I traveled and I drove to the airport. Once I got to the airport, I took a cab to the hotel and I took a cab to an offsite meeting. So how granular you want to get, it's up to you. I think the argument should be made, the more complete, the better. But there are ways to sort of estimate this and say, I probably was in a cab for this many miles versus requiring everybody to add up exactly each thing. So this is where with scope 3, it's not a utility bill with this is how many kilowatt hours you used. There's more estimation and more sort of ballparking, if you will. Commuting, so all your employees have to get to work. This is another one. It seems relatively straightforward. Then actually figuring that out can be a little more complicated. So, how many days of work do they come in? How many miles away do they live? Are they seasonal? All these types of things. So there's a few ways. We haven't done this yet, but there's a few ways to go about this. And the one that we think we'd likely do is we'd send out a survey to staff, asking them to answer questions, how many days a week do you, how do you get to work? How many days a week are you here? How far away do you live from work? And then, you're not going to be able to calculate this for every single one of your employees unless, maybe you would, but it seems unlikely, especially the bigger you get. So it is acceptable practice to, survey and then extrapolate from once you hit a certain percentage of respondents to extrapolate to the entire institution from that. So you have 100 employees, you get 25 to respond. The more that respond, the more accurate you can be, but you can say, okay, 25 is a fair sample size. You multiply that by 4, just for example. So that would be a way to go about doing that. Product transport, this is another one, right? We get deliveries from Amazon and all over the place quite regularly. The guidance here is just to indicate what came and what kind of vehicle did it come on. You also have to look at relative to your overall emissions, how much of this is going to be a factor in it. And so if it's something like, product transport, if you're getting a whole lot of stuff, then if you don't do the time to record this, you might be missing a lot of your emissions. But at the same time, you can kind of go crazy trying to figure out how many deliveries were made in a year and stuff like that. So our planned approach to this is we have trucks that deliver for seasonal flower shows a few times a year. We might have a truck coming up from Florida full of flowers. And so that's pretty easy to say, okay, this truck is coming from this nursery. It has, you could do the vehicle miles on it and calculate it that way. So we know this many trucks are coming per year. We have a trailer that stores a lot of our winter light garden materials. So that comes on site and that leaves once a year. We know where that is and coming and going. We have tents that are set up for outside events. And so those come on trucks. So the way we think we're going to approach this, and again, everywhere will be different, but is to at least capture those big ones that you know, and then kind of make an estimation perhaps about the rest of the stuff that's coming sort of on a day-to-day basis. And as long as you're transparent about your process in doing this, then that's really the thing. It's not this just black box where you plug in a number and that's your data. For things like this, you should be transparent about and just indicate what your logic was. This is why we came up with this number. We know that this isn't dead on, but this is, we think, reasonable because of this is how we did it. And then the last tab under scope 3 is waste. So the stuff that you're sending off site. So again, we know this is going to be an estimation as well. We know that the dumpster, the company comes to get our dumpster this many times, right? We know when they come because we're billed for it. And the assumption is that that dumpster's full, but it's not necessarily full. So we're not weighing each time, so we can make a fair estimate. We're probably overestimating our carbon emissions by saying the dumpster was full each time. But you know, you can make sort of adjustments based on reasonable data. The other thing you could do is if you do waste audits, you can extrapolate from that. So if you do a waste audits a couple times a year to see how that varies, you could then extend that and have a more it's a more accurate sort of count. But again, this is going to just require some, you know, depending on your institution, it might require some, okay, this is our best guess and this is why this is our best guess. Then if you purchase offsets, carbon offsets, things like that, there is the capacity to enter those here, and then those come off your emissions in the summary page. And then the rest of it is you know, information about unit conversions, help pages, things like that. And this all takes us back to the summary. Once you go through and complete everything, you'll have your metric tons of CO2 equivalents, and then that's it. You'll see here it does your market-based and your location-based. So for those couple of things, steam and electricity, there's two different values. And so you can see, you know, they're both correct figures. It's just a different way of accounting. And then that's it. See, I don't know if you have want to add anything before we hop into questions, but by all means.
I think I'm good. Thank you.
Okay, thank you, Steve and Adam. That was really great. What we'd like to do now is I'm going to ask Annie Schvack to come on, and she's going to lead the question and answer section.
Awesome. Thank you, Richard. And thank you, Adam and Steve, for doing this. Congratulations. We all know how to do an energy audit now. Going forward, I do want to emphasize that we did love this audit because you can customize and you can use this audit to the best of your ability to your unique organization. And going forward, we just had a question. So we had a question about how long did the audit take to complete?
Steve, you wanna go first?
Fortunately, I had all this data, the invoices, all this information on a computer, on my computer. So, and I had been tracking some of this data over the years anyway. So with adding this information into this calculator, trying to figure out, you know, what category the vehicles fall into, getting the information about the generators, making phone calls and whatnot. For hours, it was about 8 hours worth of work on the computer, putting it into the data, into the calculator.
Yeah, I'd agree. It was about that much. I should note too that I'm not in the facilities department, and some of this was kind of Greek to me, which I think demonstrates that the tool is built in a way that someone that's not that, you know, not that well versed or smart like me can do it. So it was just some conversations with facilities to understand like the refrigerants and things like that. And then it was a little bit of going through bills and talking to accounting and getting them to send stuff. But I would say about 8 hours is pretty reasonable.
Would you both say it's safe to say that the first time you do it is probably going to take a little bit longer because you have to do some detective work. But certainly once you've done it the first time and you know what kind of stuff to keep track of, it should be a lot quicker in subsequent years.
That's exactly right. And so, yeah, you can put those processes in place knowing that you're going to want that data going forward to make it all the easier and quicker.
Mhm.
Okay, so we had also another question, and this question said, with this carbon tool, do you also have to calculate how much fertilizers are being applied yearly, plus any carbon sequestration resulted from that?
Yeah, that's a good point. So this doesn't capture that. What I think would be plausible is if you could calculate what that figure would be, you could add it in somewhere else in the spreadsheet, but so that you have an accounting that, or do it separately. Use this as a tool to get all that, and then as gardens, we're sort of unique in our use relative to other institutions. So if something's not on here, I think it's fair to say you could find somewhere to put it in that would give you a similar GWP, a similar emissions figure, or just use this and have your number and then add anything additional that unique to your situation that would be a significant source.
Can I just add that we looked, because we plant a lot of trees, and I see a bunch of people on this attending this webinar who also plant a lot of trees. So we were looking for a way to calculate the carbon sequestration of tree planting. And there's not a whole lot of great calculators out there. I found a few, and I haven't arrived at a great way to use them yet. You know, one of the things I was just reading Bill Gates's new climate change book, and he doesn't put a whole lot of stock in tree planting. He puts more stock in tree conservation. Like, you know, the trees that are already there are actually doing more than the little seedlings that we're planting. So it's kind of a matter of that kind of figuring out what scope you want to go for, because if you start considering the carbon sequestration of a conserved forest area, then I don't know, it kind of seems to lose a little bit of its value for managing the things you can manage. But it's a tricky thing, and if anybody finds any good ways to calculate the carbon sequestration value of trees and tree planting, let me know, because we'd be interested.
Awesome. Thank you, Jeff. So continuing forward, there was one more question talking about, was there any information or any data that was really difficult to put into the audit? Were there any like types of fuels that were missing or vehicles that you could not put in? If so, how did you do it?
Yeah, I gave that brief example. Everything pretty much was there except that refrigerant was not on that list of all those refrigerants. And I don't know why, but it was just, I just picked one that had the most similar GWP value. So that's what I ran into. Nothing too bad.
I know for us, you know, we do have some CO2 extinguishers, fire extinguishers, and, you know, we have quite a lot of units that have refrigeration. 2018, you know, it's kind of hard to go back and look at the individual service tickets, but it's just something we'll focus on. You know, if we have to exchange a fire extinguisher, recharge it, have it tested. We do have leaks in air conditioners or, you know, refrigerators, things like that. We'll definitely track our refrigerant loss or CO2 loss in the extinguishers.
One thing I'll mention too that was nice to have Mount Cuba and Steve put all this work in, and right before the webinar, Andy combined them so we didn't have to flip between sharing screens. And so I was going through both sets and kind of just comparing. Again, every garden, every institution is going to be different, but I looked, and some of these numbers, you know, without context, you know, what is, you know, I don't know, so many pounds of HCF meat. I mean, who knows? But having someone else do it, and then you can kind of compare across gardens and see like, wow, my figure's way off. And in fact, I looked at our electricity compared to Mount Cuba's, and it was way, way, way higher. And so I looked back at the spreadsheet from facilities about our tracking, and it turns out that there was just a clerical error in the formula, and we had double counted in a few places our electricity use. And so I wouldn't have recognized that otherwise, because it's kilowatt hours, and it was on the spreadsheet, so it seemed right. So doing it in the same system and comparing with other gardens can help. I clearly, there was a mistake in ours, and that was identified through doing this and comparing. So that was kind of a nice happenstance right before this happened.
And I also have two more questions really quickly. Does any of the compost come off the waste calculations?
It does. Go to waste. There is a field to indicate any compost. I passed it up. Waste. Here we go. Landfill. Here we go. I'm having a little trouble with some of these tabs. I'm not sure why, but you can this pull down should and does typically show you landfill, compost, and I believe recycling as well. Sorry, I can't show you that. And the type of material.
So I do just want to thank everybody for coming to the seminar today. And if anyone has any more questions, feel free to email the Climate Toolkit's email, and we can get back to you with some more answers. We really want this to be a share. So we've done this audit and we've compared both Mount Cuba and Phipps, but we do want to support everyone else going through a similar process. But I'd like to turn it back over to Richard for some concluding remarks.
Thank you, Annie, and thank you, Adam and Steve and Jeff, for doing this. This was really great. I think one thing that's pretty clear to me is that this is actually doable. This is something that can be done. This is something each of us can do. And the more we do it, the easier it's going to get each time we do it. And it can give us really valuable information and really try to understand, what our emissions are and how we can then start coming up with strategies to start reducing those emissions. So I'd like to encourage everyone to try this. As Annie said, if you run into any problems, we're both organizations, we're willing to, go through with you and help you try to figure out how to do it. As I think it was, I forget if it was Jeff or Adam who said in the beginning that, there's value in each of us using the same type of calculator, because it's going to make it a lot easier for us to compare things. We're not having an apples and orange kind of situation. So that's another positive thing about this. And so, you can't fix what you can't measure. So this is a great way to start measuring things and to start making some positive contributions to addressing climate change. I'd also like to just encourage everyone, if you're not already a part of the Climate Toolkit, to consider having your institution join. It's a great way to share what you're doing with other people so we can all learn from each other. It's one of the requirements is if you join, if you agree to be a mentor, that if you're doing something and somebody else wants to try to do that as well, that you're willing to reach out and show them how you did it. And it's a great way for all of us to collectively learn and to start developing strategies where we can not only walk the talk, but then use that as an opportunity to engage our visitors. In the botanical garden world, on an international level, we reach over 500 million visitors a year. That's a huge number of people that we can have a positive impact on in each of our communities. And then, as I mentioned, we do have some friends from the zoo and the museum world online right now as well. And we'd like to encourage them to join, and we'll figure out how to make it really relevant for them as well. Then if you start looking at the numbers of all the zoos and museums and botanical gardens and aquaria and nature centers all over the world, you can see that we can have an incredible impact. And since we're all in different communities around the globe, we have, we can make those impacts at the community level. So there's really a great opportunity for all of us here. And I hope you'll consider joining and helping us make it stronger. And together we can make a positive difference. So thank you all again. I think this, for some of you, this is a first step. So welcome, and let's keep doing it. Thanks.